On the evening of 5th of February 2004, darkness settled over Morecambe Bay on England's northwest coast. The tide had retreated hours earlier, exposing miles of sand and mud. From the promenade, the bay looked vast and still, its surface broken only by shallow channels twisting across the flats. It was cold, and the wind was beginning to rise. Nearly a mile from shore, a group of workers moved steadily across the sand. They were gathering cockles, raking the surface and filling sacks that grew heavier with every pass. The work had to be finished before the sea returned. In Morecambe Bay, everything depends on the tide. Now, this is not a forgiving place. The channels shift without warning, and the sand can trap the unwary. When the tide turns, it moves fast, filling the deeper gullies first and cutting off escape routes long before the shoreline looks threatened. That night, it would not give them time. What followed would become one of the worst coastal disasters in modern British history. In early 2004, the Irish Sea had provided a bumper harvest of shellfish, and buyers were queuing up in Britain and on the continent. Big demand meant the potential for big profits, but if seafood suppliers were to meet that demand, they needed cockle pickers who could work around the clock. Cockles are small edible shellfish that live just beneath the surface of tidal flats. At low tide, they lie buried a few centimetres under the sand, drawing in seawater through tiny openings that leave faint marks on the surface. They can be gathered by hand with a short rake, loosening the top layer of sand before picking the shells out individually. In Britain, they are a traditional seaside food, often served hot with vinegar and pepper. They are also exported in large quantities to markets across Europe and Asia, where demand can drive prices up significantly. In a strong season, a productive bed can generate substantial income for those supplying seafood buyers. Cockling is physically demanding work. It must be done in the narrow window between tides. The further the beds are from the shore, the longer the walk back and the heavier the sacks become. A full bag can weigh 20 kilograms or more, and every extra minute spent gathering increases the risk of being caught out before the tide turns. In a good season, the profits for those controlling the operation can be significant, but for the workers, the pay was small. In industries such as agriculture and shellfish gathering, much of the workforce is supplied by intermediaries known as gangmasters. Some operate within the law, providing registered labour and meeting safety standards. Others exist in the margins, moving workers from job to job with little oversight. In 2004, supervision of gangmasters was patchy, particularly in seasonal sectors like Cockling. Investigators would later determine that the group working on Morecambe Bay that night had been organised by men who controlled transport, documentation and access to seafood buyers. Workers were driven to the sands in vans and expected to fill orders that had already been agreed. Permits were either forged or misused, and there was little evidence of meaningful safety planning. One of the men later convicted had presented himself as a legitimate operator, negotiating directly with buyers and positioning himself as part of the supply chain. Large orders meant large returns, and the people doing the physical labour were a cost within that calculation. On that February evening, there was an order to complete and a tide window in which to complete it. Most of the workers on the sands that night had travelled from rural communities in Fujian province. In villages where employment options were limited and incomes were low, stories circulated about opportunities overseas. Relatives and neighbours spoke of higher wages in Europe, of the chance to send money back home, of futures that might look very different from the present. Securing that opportunity required money up front. Families borrowed heavily to pay traffickers, commonly known as snakeheads, who arranged complex routes across Asia and into Europe. The journeys could involve multiple countries and long stretches hidden in vehicles. By the time migrants reached the United Kingdom, many owed sums that would take years to repay. But those debts did not exist in isolation. They were tied to family homes and relatives back in China, and repayment was expected. Without secure immigration status, the workers had limited protection and few realistic alternatives. They were housed where they were told to live, transported where they were told to work, and paid through systems they did not control. A significant portion of what they earned was diverted towards debt. Turning down work was not straightforward. On the night of the tragedy, experienced Cockling operators chose to remain ashore. The wind had strengthened and the timing of high water left little margin for delay. Those familiar with the bay understood how quickly conditions could change. Morecambe Bay has always demanded experience and caution. For centuries, crossings were led by an official guide to the sands, a role created to navigate safe routes across the shifting flats between communities on opposite sides of the bay, avoiding deep channels and unstable ground. From 1963 until 2019, that responsibility was carried out by Cedric Robinson, MBE, the Queen's Guide to the Sands. For more than half a century, he led thousands of people safely across terrain that could become lethal within minutes. He understood where the channels lay, how the wind altered the tide's return, and how quickly conditions could change. His long service was a reminder that this landscape does not yield easily to those who underestimate it. At low tide, Morecambe Bay can appear calm, a vast expanse of firm-looking sand stretching towards the horizon. In reality, it is shaped by constantly shifting channels and unpredictable ground. As the tide returns, it gathers pace, funneled by the narrowing estuary and the curve of the coastline. Locals sometimes describe it as moving as fast as a galloping horse. Now, that description is not an exaggeration. When the deeper gullies begin to fill, the water can race across the flats with startling speed, cutting off escape routes before the broader shoreline appears threatened. In winter, the sea is bitterly cold, and even strong swimmers would struggle to last long in it. Those who worked at the bay regularly respected that knowledge. Local fishermen and experienced cocklers watched the wind, studied the clouds, and measured their distance from shore against the time remaining before high water. Many would abandon a tide altogether if the margin felt too narrow. Late that afternoon, however, a group of around 30 workers were seen heading out across the flats. Trevor Fleming, a local fisherman, noticed them moving further onto the sands as the light began to fade. From his experience, the timing looked wrong. He shouted across the wind, warning them that the tide would return quickly and that they should not go further. Whether the words were not understood or whether the warning came too late is unclear, and so the group continued on. Some may have believed they still had sufficient time. Others may have relied on printed tide tables without accounting for weather conditions. It is also possible they trusted the judgment of the men who had organised the work. As evening settled in, they spread out across the cockle beds. In Morecambe Bay, the incoming tide does not always arrive as a visible wall of water. Often the first warning is subtle. A channel that was ankle-deep moments earlier, now filling more quickly than expected. A strip of sand that seemed solid, becoming an island. And by the time the workers realised the water was rising around them, the geography of the bay had already begun to change. Channels between the cockle beds and the shore were filling first, quietly severing the routes that they had used to walk out. In the darkness, it was difficult to judge depth or distance. The shoreline lights can appear deceptively close, but the water between them and safety was spreading. Cold seawater drains strength rapidly. Clothing becomes heavy, boots fill, and each step requires more effort than the last. At first, there may have been confusion rather than panic, an assumption that they could still retrace their path. Then the realisation would have come that the water was no longer retreating, but advancing from more than one direction. The cocklers realised they were trapped. Voices were raised. Workers began calling out to each other across the wind. Some tried to wade back across the way they had come. Others moved towards what they believed was higher ground. Mobile phones were taken from pockets with wet hands. Unaware of how to contact the emergency services, some frantically phoned friends and family both in England and in China in an attempt to raise the alarm. At 9:23 p.m, emergency services received a call from a mobile phone somewhere out on the sands. The caller spoke limited English. The phrase, "sinking water," was repeated. In the background there were shouts and the sound of wind. The connection cut before operators could determine a precise location. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard got their first inkling of trouble when an off-duty lifeboatman reported seeing a vehicle driving erratically on the sands. At first, it was assumed to be young people taking risks on the exposed flats. It was only when the timing of the tide was considered and further calls came in that the seriousness of the situation became clear. High water was approaching, and anyone still far from shore would soon be surrounded. Within minutes, the Coast Guard received a second call, this time from an Englishwoman. She said she knew a group of cockle pickers were trapped out in the bay. Search and rescue teams were deployed immediately, calling in all branches of the emergency services. Helicopters lifted off into the dark, lifeboats and hovercraft headed out across difficult water. The conditions were harsh enough that rescuers themselves were exposed to danger. Without exact coordinates, they were searching for people in black water under a black sky. Out on the bay, the workers were now scattered. Some were waist deep, others deeper. Those who attempted to swim would have faced freezing temperatures and powerful currents. Darkness removed any sense of direction, and the shoreline lights shimmered in the distance, offering hope but no clear path. Emergency services briefly re-established contact with one of the trapped workers. They could not understand the words being spoken, but they could hear the fear. The call ended abruptly. At around 10 p.m, a police helicopter crew spotted one man clinging to Priest's Skier, a rocky outcrop nearly a mile offshore. An RNLI hovercraft reached him and brought him to safety. He was one of the few who would survive. As the tide reached its height and began to fall again in the early hours, the scale of what had happened slowly emerged. Bodies were recovered across the sands. Some were found close to one another, suggesting they had tried to stay together. Others lay alone. By morning, 19 had been found. In total, 23 people had drowned. The survivors who made it back to shore were soaked, shaking, and in shock. Many were frightened not only by what they had experienced, but by what might happen next. Without secure immigration status, speaking to authorities carried its own risks. Initial accounts were confused. Some claimed they had been on a picnic. Investigators suspected that pressure was being applied behind the scenes. 23 people were dead. The immediate question was no longer how the tide had moved, but why they had been sent onto the sands at all. By dawn, the scale of what had happened was undeniable. What had begun in darkness as a desperate rescue operation was now a scene of recovery and identification. The focus shifted from searching the water to understanding how 23 people had come to be stranded there in the first place. Lancashire police opened a manslaughter inquiry. In the hours that followed, 11 Chinese nationals and 1 Englishwoman were taken into custody. Immigration checks revealed that many of the workers had entered the country illegally. Officers had recovered cockling permits, all bearing false names, but getting explanations from the survivors was proving tough. A few answers the survivors gave made little sense, and their explanation for being out in the bay on that cold February night was clearly a lie. Initial witnesses said they'd been on a picnic. Others gave vague accounts that did not withstand scrutiny. Detectives quickly sensed that something was being concealed. As interviews continued, it became apparent that the group was not speaking freely. One senior officer later recalled how the dynamic in the room was unmistakable. A small number of individuals appeared calm, composed, and watchful. The others seemed hesitant, glancing towards them before answering even the simplest questions. It looked less like a group of friends and more like a hierarchy. 4 individuals were identified as possible organisers and placed under arrest. 3 were Chinese nationals. The 4th was an Englishwoman, Janie Bannister, the same woman who had called the Coast Guard to raise the alarm. 5 months pregnant at the time, Bannister told detectives she wanted to tell the truth. She said the man responsible was already in custody, but that he was lying about his role. Her account pointed to 2 men, her partner, Lin Mu Yong, and his cousin, Lin Liang Ren. According to Bannister, Ren had secured a substantial cockle order from a local seafood supplier. Rather than delay or cancel it, he insisted that workers go out onto the sands despite the conditions. On the night of the tragedy, police found Ren walking along a road 2 miles from the beach, but he flatly denied being involved. This contradicted Bannister's claim that Ren was in charge and had been waiting at the shore as the workers walked out to sea. Police believed Janie and no longer suspected her of wrongdoing, but hers was a lone voice. All the other survivors backed Wren's version of events. No admissions were coming from anywhere else. Investigators understood immediately that this case would not be built on confession. It would have to be proven piece by piece. It was quite clear at that early stage that we were going to have to prove everything. It was Janie's word against everyone else, and the allegation was she was only saying that to get out of custody and trouble. Detectives desperately needed other survivors to talk, but 3 days of questioning brought nothing. The survivors, still fearful and uncertain of their own legal position, were handed over to the asylum service. Shortly afterwards, many of them disappeared. For the investigation, it was a serious setback. As one officer later put it, the country wanted answers, and the only people who could provide them had vanished. Tracing the witnesses again became crucial. Police needed both the survivors and the help of Chinese communities across the UK. Some survivors had given patently false accounts, and then almost immediately after the event, some disappeared. It looked unpromising. Tracking them down wouldn't be easy. As illegal immigrants, they were used to living under the radar. Appeals were placed in Chinese language newspapers. Interpreters were brought in to reassure potential witnesses that they would not automatically face deportation for cooperating. But fear ran deep, not only of immigration authorities, but of the men who had arranged their journey and who still had influence over families back home. The debt that financed the migration was more than financial. It created leverage. Despite efforts in Britain, the breakthrough came 5,000 miles away, far away from the cold shores of Morecambe Bay. 6 days after the tragedy, authorities were able to identify the stranded cockle picker who had made the frantic phone call while drowning. A newspaper published a front-page picture of the man's family holding up his photograph. His name was Guo Bin Long. He'd arrived in Britain 12 months earlier. The truck driver had left behind a wife, a son and an adoptive daughter, hoping to make enough money to give them a better life. Those dreams ended on Morecambe Sands on February the 5th, 2004. That night, as well as calling the emergency services, he had also phoned his family in Fujian. We were all still asleep except for his parents. He said he was now in great danger and asked his mother to pray for him. He said, "I am in the sea now, and the water is up to my neck. Pray for me." And then the sound disappeared. His mother woke us up and we started to pray for him while waiting for his phone call, but nothing came. The identification of Guo Bin Long helped authorities discover the names of other victims. One by one, their stories emerged. Many had families depending on them. Their deaths plunged relatives into deeper poverty, strengthening determination to prosecute those responsible. For detectives in Lancashire, the investigation was no longer abstract. Each name carried a history. Each history reinforced the urgency of holding someone accountable. The question remained the same. Who had sent them out onto the sands that night? Police gradually identified most of the 23 dead cockle pickers. But to get justice, they still needed to track down the survivors and persuade them to testify against Lin Liang Ren. The hunt for key witnesses led detectives to one of the oldest Chinese communities in Britain and brought them face to face with feared underworld figures. In the end, it was the greed of the gangs that gave police their breakthrough. Payments from workers into bank accounts could be traced, revealing huge sums of money moving from the UK to China. Police identified a key figure at the heart of one financial network. In a bold move, Detective Mick Gradwell decided to approach him for help. It was a rather bizarre conversation, one of those conversations of, "I know that you know that I know what you're doing, but I want your help." Within hours of the meeting, the first missing survivor turned up. Over the following year, detectives re-established contact with almost all of the surviving workers. Winning their trust took time. At first, meetings were fruitless. The survivors were cautious and frightened. They did not understand legal procedure in Britain. They feared deportation and feared revenge against themselves or their families. Interpreters and liaison officers worked patiently, explaining legal protections and reassuring them that they were being treated as witnesses, not suspects. Gradually, accounts began to align. Several survivors confirmed that Lin Liang Ren had been in charge. They described how he had secured a significant cockle order and insisted the group go out despite worsening conditions. Some said he had remained near the shore as they worked. Others said that after the tide turned, he had instructed them to say nothing about his involvement. Armed with witness testimony and financial evidence, detectives charged Wren with 23 counts of manslaughter and facilitating illegal immigration. His trial began at Preston Crown Court in September 2005. The outcome depended heavily on whether the survivors would testify in open court. In the months before trial, some survivors received phone calls from home. The message was simple: do not testify. Police conducted continuous risk assessments. The witnesses understood that by speaking publicly they were placing themselves and potentially their families at risk. In the end, 11 of the 12 survivors took the stand. Wren was found guilty of manslaughter and facilitation of illegal immigrants. He was sentenced to 14 years. British dealers he'd been supplying were exonerated of any blame in the tragedy. For the survivors who testified, feelings were mixed. They were granted temporary asylum in the UK but remained fearful of reprisals. For the families of those who drowned, the conviction brought a degree of accountability, but it did little to ease the realities they faced at home. Many had borrowed heavily to fund the journey to Europe, taking out loans through relatives, local lenders, or informal community networks. The expectation had been that wages earned abroad would repay those debts and lift the family's prospects. Instead, the income stopped overnight, while the repayments did not. In some cases, children were left without one or both parents, and with families still burdened by the money that had financed the migration. Among them was Shu Bing, the teenage son of one of the victims. His parents had travelled to Britain in the hope of building a more secure future for him. Within hours of speaking to him on the phone, they were gone. In the months that followed, grief was compounded by financial pressure, as relatives struggled to meet the obligations that remained. For Guo Bin Long's family, the impact was especially devastating. His mother had answered the phone on the night he called to say the water was up to his neck. She had heard the fear in his voice and the wind in the background before the line went silent. In the aftermath of his death, the family faced not only mourning, but the weight of outstanding debt, and the knowledge that his journey, meant to provide stability, had ended in tragedy. Overwhelmed by grief and financial strain, she later took her own life. For those who had worked the case in Lancashire, the call handlers, the Coast Guard, the rescuers who had searched the dark water, one detail endured above all others. The phrase, "sinking water," spoken in broken English over a failing line, became inseparable from the night itself. Long after the trial concluded and the headlines faded, that call remained. It was a reminder that behind the statistics and the legal arguments were voices, families, and final moments that could never be undone. Public reaction in Britain was immediate and intense. The tragedy exposed significant weaknesses in the regulation of labour providers, particularly in agriculture and shellfish gathering. In response, the government introduced the Gangmasters Licensing Act, establishing what is now the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority. Labour providers in these sectors must now be licensed, inspected, and held accountable for the treatment and safety of workers. Cockling in Morecambe Bay is now subject to tighter oversight. Permits are monitored, enforcement is stronger, and safety planning is more rigorous. The tides, however, have not changed. Morecambe Bay still empties twice a day, revealing the same wide expanse of sand. The channels still shift, and the incoming water still gathers speed as it returns. The men and women who walked out onto the sands that evening believed they were working towards something better for their families. The sea claimed them, but it was human decisions that placed them there. Morecambe Bay may well have returned to its normal routine and rhythms. But on the 5th of February 2004, 23 lives were lost there. And behind each of those lives was a family who had hoped that the journey across the world would lead to somewhere better. Now, this was a terrible tragedy, and our condolences go out to those families. And despite the nature of the tragedy, I hope you like the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll say bye-bye for now.